Okay, so let's now consider using observation techniques in research and education. In this PowerPoint you'll see the context that you've seen previously. Refer back to this, pause and think about this when you look at the question later on. There's lots there to think about. So there's different types of observation. There's structured observation and there's unstructured observation, which can be non-PO or it can be PO, overt or covert. So let's look back at what you remember about participant observation. Well, first of all, participant observation, some theoretical points, tends to be qualitative. Validity is quite strong. Ethnographic, it gets close to groups and their cultures. Preferred by interpretivists who are looking for meanings, is felt to be subjective rather than objective. There is, of course, the difference between non-PO and PO. So non-PO where you're not involved with the group, as against PO where you are. And there's overt where you're open, as against covert where your identity is hidden. You might remember that overt, as I just said, is open, is felt to be ethical with informed consent. There's a degree of freedom and a level of involvement that you can control, but there is the dilemma of the Hawthorne effect. And of course with covert you've got more natural behaviour. You can see people in their natural behaviour, dig deeper, you can see secretive worlds, but there is the issue of deception. If you go back to your PowerPoint notes and your class notes on PO, you'll see a lot more on these factors. Other issues though, if you go back you'll see the challenges of getting in, staying in and getting out, of maintaining an authentic role once you're within a group, actually getting that role and maintaining it, the challenge of going native where you become sympathetic with groups, and the challenge of exiting a group when you get to the end and you have to leave. There is of course guilty knowledge where people, you see things which are immoral or wrong, and what do you do about that? It's a very time consuming and an expensive method, and it tends to use small samples and therefore lacks representativity. So just a quick word on structured observation for a moment. Structured observation is in effect, it's where you have a pre-coded schedule. You have it's like a questionnaire really. You have a chart, you have a table with columns and tick boxes or things that you circle on that form. It tends to generate numbers, that's what it's there for. It's quantitative and it can be used for comparisons. Now at the side of the page here you've got an extract which is taken from the Flanders interaction system, where observing lessons you can observe feelings, you can observe the amount of attention that teachers give to male pupils, to female pupils, positive and negative, how much time they spend, which pupils they're talking to. You can end up with a very numerical picture of what goes on inside a classroom. So counting is key. It can involve timing intervals. It can be a very reliable method, the structured observation technique, where you can go between schools, between classes and just use the same form again and again, and you can compare the numerical data. Not felt to be valid. Counting does not give an insight into meanings or the reasons behind behaviour. So if a teacher is being biased towards male students, we don't know why that is, we just know it's there. So then when we look at unstructured observation, practical issues to think about. Schools are complex places. It takes a lot of time to familiarise yourselves once you get within inside a school. Now observations though are easy to arrange. They're less intrusive than interviews. They're less demanding on a school. The observers go into a room, they observe and they leave. There isn't any specific time need to be set aside. And with that, permission isn't needed. Parental permission is not needed for observations. But the personal characteristics can have an impact here. If you're a female observer observing a classroom, you can have an impact on pupils. And Cecile Wright found this with her research looking at the experience of black pupils in British schools in the 1990s, where the black students, because she herself was a black researcher, the students related to her well. It may have been a different story if a white researcher was being used. And of course another practical fact to think about is these are limited by the timetable and the school calendar. Covert is difficult to record as well. it's difficult for you to make notes, particularly with teachers rather than with pupils. You know, you're trying to observe them in a staff room and see what's taking place. They see you writing things down. They're very sceptical. Ethical issues tend to be over in schools because of the issue of the vulnerability of children, and there is of course the issue of observing things while you're within a school that may bring about a guilty knowledge, which brings about a dilemma of reporting or not. And if you do report, you breach the pupil trust, and that therefore brings the end to your research. So there's that to think about. So anonymity even is vital to protect the identities of those involved. And schools like that because at the marketisation level, they don't want their schools to be known in the outcomes of the research. There is potentially the Hawthorne effect. There are very few cover roles within schools, so people will know that they're being seen, and that will have an impact, and the observer presence therefore has to be considered. In relation to validity, it can be good for giving a world view of pupils and teachers, how they see the world, what they're experiencing. So we have a degree of Verstehen there, which is preferred by interpretivists. But there is, of course, the problem of impression management, where teachers can adjust their behaviour because they know somebody's watching them, and pupils can do the same. And relating to pupils distrusting the man, particularly working class pupils who have an issue with authority figures. And then also in relation to validity is the matter of interpreting the language used by children. You see the way they're talking, engage with each other, looking through the lens of an adult eye. It can be quite difficult to see what's actually taking place. In relation to representativeness, of course, these are small scale. As you know, with Paul Willis's work, he only used 12 lads. Very few can be done. They're quite lengthy to conduct. It takes a long time to get involved, to develop a role, to stay in, etc. It takes time. And it's therefore hard to generalise across all schools you're finding from a small sample. And bearing in mind as well, in terms of representative, what kind of people are going to allow you close to them to observe them. Teachers are very sceptical of newcomers, so only those a certain type will be forthcoming to embrace a new arrival. And within the staff room, therefore, it's a limited access to a limited type of teacher. You may not be getting the typical view of the typical teacher. And finally, in terms of reliability, they're unsystematic. You can't replicate them. They're all unique, and that therefore raises issues. And you also the fact that even if you did try to repeat them, respondents react differently to different observers. So responding to female observers differently to male observers, or to black observers to white observers. So it's not a consistent process, and hence positivists and the like are quite critical of these. So let's look at an exam question very briefly. If you pause for a moment and study the item, I'd rather you do this before moving on with this video cast. So study what you can see here, think what the issue is, think what groups are involved, think about the vested interest of those involved, think how they're going to engage with this research, think about this method and how useful this method is for this particular topic. So I'll just let you pause now before moving on. Okay, here's the mark scheme. As you can see here, there's some ideas. I'm not going to go into too much detail. You can read this yourself. But there are some suggestions that are given. If you look at the difference between the 17 to 20 mark band down to the 9 to 12 mark band, you see a variation in the level of sort of detail and depth that students can go into. So focusing now upon this extract and on this issue, I would suggest at a glance reading it, as you can see, the topic is about pupil exclusions. So in relation to your topic knowledge, you will know that exclusions are normally for poor behaviour. We know that kids from lower social class backgrounds and some ethnic minority groups, particularly black pupils, are more represented in school exclusions than others. There tends to be an anti-school subculture associated with poor discipline, poor behaviour, pupils that are anti-authority. There is also a degree of an alpha male machismo, which can tie in with the boys in the extract. And And a lot of these pupils tend to struggle academically in the bottom sets, or they may have been put into the bottom sets because of their behaviour, and they may find that frustrating. So that's something that we know about the topic from our knowledge. In terms of the method in context, if we look at the extract, it does talk about 1 in 20 pupils excluded, physical assaults against staff, no reliable figures. Pupils can self-exclude by truanting, so not just done by the school, or they're going to switch off in class as well. There's all sorts of different ways that pupils can exclude. And if you read more, it talks about ethnic differences and pupils with special education needs and poorer pupils, and something about the method. But it's some food for thought. Poor attendance is bad for the school image. Think how the schools are going to relate to any research of this, and how poor behaviour is also bad for a school image. So they're going to let teachers go to those classes to observe those pupils. Also the issue of finding a suitable role for the researcher, how you can fit into certain groups. And as we know, there may be a high degree of distrust for the man, especially from lower class pupils and from certain ethnic minority pupils, particularly if they've got different features to themselves. If you can imagine a very academic middle class researcher being perceived by kids off the estate. And also you've got the fact that many of these kids are actually missing from school in the first place, so the researcher can't actually get to them. How do females relate to male pupils, so female researchers and male pupils? But there is the issue, maybe they could get a support role as a TA, teacher and assistant, working within a classroom where they're supporting the pupils, and that might get a degree of trust as they're helping them to do better. So food for thought there. Try and bring that all together if you can.